Welcome and good morning, everybody. My name is Julie McDonough, and I'm your co-host for the Good Leadership Breakfast. And now I get to introduce my co-host this morning. He is the creator of the Good Leadership Breakfast. He's an author, a blogger, an executive coach, and the CEO of Good Leadership Enterprises. Please welcome Paul Bach.
Every year I find myself thinking about momentum theory. It just seems like everything in the Midwest or the bold North just sort of takes a new pace as the springtime comes. So as we transition now, I'm really excited to introduce you to a good leader who radiates goodness. So please join me in welcoming our speaker today, Phil McKoy.
So it's really interesting. You know, I work for United Healthcare, and I spend a lot of time speaking to people, huge forums, large rooms, and I've probably never been more nervous to have a conversation than I am right now. And I think the part that makes me nervous is you're asking me to talk about myself. And I'm not really sure why that's that interesting. But anyway, let's get going. So quickly, I'm not a native Minnesotan. Even though try as hard as I might, I still elongate my O's. I grew up in rural Jamaica. I grew up in a little village called Fairfield. And to give you a sense of just how rural this is, when I meet other Jamaicans, and I always get excited when I meet other Jamaicans, and I tell them where I'm from, if I tell them I'm from Fairfield, about 90% of them have no idea where that is. And to give you a sense of where it is, Fairfield is about 8 miles outside of a town called Mandeville. And Mandeville sits in the middle of the island in a parish called Manchester Parish, and it's primarily an agricultural parish. I grew up the son of a country pastor and an English teacher. My mom was an English teacher, and she was from another island in the Caribbean, St. Kitts. And I grew up in this rural area for the first 10 years of my life. Got an older brother and a younger sister. First 10 years of my life, running around shirtless most of the time, running around barefoot most of the time, profoundly carefree. But I also went to school in the city center in the town of Mandeville, where I was around, that was big city for me. So I went to school surrounded by other kids of expats at the school where my mom taught. I moved to the U.S. when I was 12 years old. And this was probably one of the biggest changes in my life when I moved here at 12. We moved to city of Decatur, which is right outside of Atlanta. And we moved because my dad was coming to attend seminary, and the plan was for him to come and attend seminary, and then we would all move back. And we made a decision while he was in seminary to stay here. My mom chose to become an English teacher at our high school, and we decided to stay. And my dad moved back to Jamaica for a period of time to fulfill his obligation teaching at the seminary in Jamaica. And it was interesting. There are a lot of things that I went through in that period of time that really shaped how I thought about myself and thought about life later on. A few things are coming from a solidly middle-class background to the U.S., and moving here and experiencing things like free and reduced lunch at school, because the income level of my parents wasn't that high. My dad essentially was a student for a period of time. My mom wasn't working at all. Moving here and experiencing the generosity of others. At Columbia Presbyterian Seminary in Decatur, they have an area or a place called Clothes Closet. And what Clothes Closet is, it's all the clothes are donated, right? And as they bring in students and families from other parts of the world, they brought in, you can go shop at Clothes Closet. And that's where, I didn't need a winter coat. I live in Minnesota now, but I thought Atlanta was cold. And you would go and you would shop for clothes, and you would receive from the generosity of others to put clothes on your back. I went to high school in Atlanta, and then I went to college in Lexington, Virginia, Washington and Lee University, if any of you guys have heard of that. And then immediately following college, I went to graduate school at the University of Denver, where I got a degree in international affairs and my specialization's international economics. And you think about that background, my major in college was political science, working for a massive company that probably comes in useful now. But how does a guy who has a bachelor's in political science and a master's in international affairs end up in technology? And I didn't really give a rip about technology when I was coming through school. What I knew was I had a passion for working internationally, and I knew that's what I wanted to do. I'm also profoundly impatient. And so as I was sitting in graduate school trying to figure out what I wanted to do next and trying to figure out how I could get to that goal of working internationally as fast as possible, I decided that the fastest path would be consulting. I considered a number of the big companies, right? I think about companies here in town, Cargill, General Mills, 3M, these massive multinational companies. And I knew those were all great options for working internationally. But I wasn't really willing to toil for 10 to 12 years to get to middle management, to get a plum international assignment. And so I interviewed with Anderson Consulting when I was in graduate school. And one of the things that they talked about, and really, it was a sell job, but it proved out correctly for me, was you go where the work is, right? And, and if you've got the right skills and, that job's in, I don't know, pick your country, you'll go where the work is. And that proved to be true. And I remember when I joined Anderson Consulting and, you do your 3-week coding, you learn to code, and I'm like, what am I doing here? And then what I found was that I loved this notion of shaping outcomes, right? I loved not necessarily the technology itself, but I loved this idea of listening to people, listening to clients, listening to business partners, and trying to figure out how to go solve something. And that excited me. And it's also when I started to learn a little bit more about leading and around leadership and what it meant to be a leader. And I'll tell you, that really cemented not only my love for tech, but my love for leadership. And there are three sort of influences that I've had on my leadership over the years. I learned to serve from my dad, right? My dad was a country pastor, and if you think about where we lived about 8 miles outside of Mandeville. There was no phone in our house. Didn't have a phone in our house until we moved to Kingston for a couple of years. And so the electricity ran to our house. And so if you were between our house, the house and the church in town, you had electricity. But if you were past the church, you had no electricity. And my dad was more than a pastor. He had a car, right, which not many people in our community had cars. And I have these memories of a kid of the late night knock at the door, right? And my dad getting up in his tighty-whities and his, and his white undershirt and going to the door. And I always remember the urgency of the knock and the urgency of my dad getting up. And he was not only a pastor, he was an ambulance, right? I don't know how many people my dad probably drove to hospital for, births or some other emergency. He was a policeman at times, right? Negotiating issues that had happened in the community. I learned a lot about what it means to work hard, also from my experience growing up in Jamaica. If you're a country church, you make money from the agriculture around you, and you generally have a caretaker that actually does the work managing the church's farm. And there was a man that he literally only maybe passed away 3 or 4 years ago. He would have been well in his 90s when he passed away. His name was Mass Egbert. Probably a grade school education, I would bet. Had 9 children. All of his 9 children have gone to college and have gone on to great things. But what I loved about him was I've never seen anyone work so hard. Back-breaking labor in fields in the hot Jamaican country sun. And what I loved is how he drove his children to be more than what he was. The third huge influence in terms of shaping how I think about my leadership was someone who I've actually never met. It's my grandfather, James Claxton. And James Claxton lived in St. Kitts, where my mom was from. And this notion of legacy, this notion of influence. So if you go to St. Kitts, and more people are going to St. Kitts now because it's becoming a big cruise destination, there are streets named after my grandfather. And when I'm in St. Kitts and people ask me who I am, I actually don't use my dad's last name. I use my mom's last name, Claxton. And it resonates. And I didn't understand or appreciate what that meant until I became an adult. But the notion that you can have an influence in a country, a small country, but you can have an influence in a country and on people that survives for such a long time. And it makes me think a lot about what's the impact that I leave on the people that I'm around every day, and what's the impact that I leave on the places where I work, and what will people say about me long after I'm gone. And that sticks with me, and it drives the way I behave and the way I treat people. So what do I do today? I'm the CIO for United Healthcare, one of the two segments of United Health Group, the largest health and well-being company here in the U.S., in the world, actually. When I joined United in summer of 2016, the person that actually probably streamlined that sitting here in the room, that's another story for another day. When I joined, I knew that I wanted to be in healthcare. And when I left Target, I went from Accenture to Target to AMIA. When I left Target back in 2014, I knew I wanted to work in healthcare. This is a healthcare town. And I knew that my digital background and my big consulting background would play in healthcare. And eventually I ended up there. And people say, why do you do what you do? What excites you about it? And it's the mission. Right? United Health Group's mission is to help people be healthier and to help the health system work better for everyone. And I'm all in. I'm all bought in. Because I believe that healthcare is the most pressing issue in our country today. And it pains me to think about when you hear statements such as, the biggest determinant of your health outcomes is your zip code, right? And I think about my background and how I grew up. I think about the generosity of others, the generosity of services that I've received over the course of my life. And I think that our responsibility as a company is to make sure that we make healthcare available, accessible, and affordable to everyone in this country. You know, healthcare is changing, and United Healthcare plays a huge part in that. And if you think about some of the shifts that are occurring, we're going from a traditional fee-for-service model to more value-based care, where we're partnering with health systems and providers to focus on outcomes. We're going from just paying for care, just paying the bills, to trying to do a better job of helping to organize care, to give clinical guidance, to work with providers, to share information, to try and help that care is being delivered better. And if you think about healthcare, you have this narrow view of health that in many ways is primarily episodic, right? When you go to the doctor, if you have a chronic condition. And we're trying to move to this notion of whole person health, where we're thinking about health not just in terms of medical, but also trying to think in health in terms of social determinants. And again, that resonates really deeply for me if you think about how I've grown up and what I've seen in the communities that I've experienced over time. And then the last one is where my background comes in pretty heavily, is to think about this notion of how do we go from being known as red tape, right, and bureaucracy and administration, and moving to a focus where experience matters. Your experience with us, your experience with us as a patient or as a member, and then the experience of all of the providers and health systems that we partner with us as a partner in helping make people healthier. There's a statement that we say a lot around, no one cares how big we are, right? No one does, right? And I think for a long time, we would talk certainly with investors about our size, and that's cool and all, but nobody cares how big we are. A mom where it's 7 a.m. who has a 9 a.m. meeting and just wants to figure out a way to get a kid's ear looked at quickly, doesn't care how big we are if we can't give her the right information at her fingertips to go make the right choices. A doctor who is trying to get an authorization for a critical piece of care for one of their patients doesn't care how big we are, right? And I think that part of my role as a technologist inside of United Healthcare is to try and help us deliver on that mission. And I think technology plays an absolutely critical role in delivering on that. And I think it's also good, when I joined United Healthcare, I'd spent a lot of time at Target, another big company. And within maybe a week or two, I had the same realization that someone else famous did as well, which is healthcare is really complicated, right? And I would say things like, man, we're not selling socks here, right? It's an incredibly complicated business where the tenure and the knowledge of the people that we work with is incredibly valuable. But at the same time, I hope that I bring a new perspective as an outsider, as someone with a more consumer retail background, to say, hey, you wouldn't accept that from a store in which you shopped. You wouldn't accept that from your bank. And so why do we accept those types of experiences in healthcare? And I think technology plays a pretty critical role in that. So I have a few principles that I think guide me and drive me. The first one is work hard, really hard, right? Work hard, really hard. And I have a 17-year-old boy. I have 5 kids: a son who's 17, a daughter who's 15, a daughter who's 13, a daughter who's 11, a daughter who's 7. And a St. Paul wife. I forgot to mention that earlier. It's on tape. I got it in. And nothing bugs me more than not working hard. I mean, I literally get enraged when Max has one job. It's trash and recycling. It's Monday nights, pickups Tuesday morning. Like, come on, it's one job, man. Nail it, right? And, Amy brokers these arguments between us, because I get irritated if he forgets one of the trash in the bathroom. Like, come on, man, it's one job. Nail it. So work hard, really, really hard. Another one of my principles is the notion that you gotta feel people. You really gotta feel them. You gotta feel the people that you work with. You gotta understand their backgrounds. You've gotta understand what motivates them in the moment. It's always interesting when I meet with people, get to know, or tell me your story. Like, where'd you come from? Where in the cities do you live? Do you like to fish? And if the answer is yes, that's a good thing, right? I think you've really got to feel people as a leader, and if you don't, you're not going to be effective. And so I was introduced to this concept of goodness, long after, deep into my career. Paul, we met a couple of years ago, 2-3 years ago, and introduced to this concept. And then, as I've sat and I've read the book and I've been at a few breakfasts, I'm like, well, what does goodness mean? What does it mean to me, right? And I think the first one's humility. That's why this makes me so nervous. I don't like talking about myself. I like to lead from behind. Especially when things are going well, I like to lead from behind. When it hits the fan, I'll be in front, and I'll take the daggers from my team. But I think humility is, when I think of goodness, humility really is the first one. Empathy, when I talk about feeling people. And empathy is so hard. It's hard to feel people, especially as you become an executive, and especially when you have to make really hard decisions. Some of the hardest things for me are when I have to manage performance and make decisions around whether we have the right people on the bus or not the right people on the bus. And I'd like to think, my human capital partner is in the room. She can tell you the best of me and the worst of me. I'd like to think that my focus on feeling people actually makes me more effective at managing performance. And then the last part, when I think about what goodness means to me, is I think if you lead with people, results follow. And if you talk about a playbook and a play that I've run, and I've run it my entire career, and it has never let me down. And I think if you lead with people first, results will follow. So thank you. I appreciate you guys coming out to hear a little bit about my story. And Paul and the Good Leadership team, I appreciate you having me.
So as you heard me say earlier, I've done this breakfast 76 times, and this is the first time that the speakers asked me if we can stand during the interview. So here we are, standing.
Then I can move.
Yes, you can, and so can I. Yeah, that's right. So we're going to start. Can you be more precise? Will you help us understand exactly how IT is improving our healthcare experience?
I'll give you two quick examples. So anyone ever try to find a doctor? Right? So I'll give you one great example. So you hear people talk about sexy technologies, and you hear people talk about blockchain and all of the buzz there. But we're using blockchain in one specific example, and it's for provider search. And what we're trying to do through blockchain is we're creating a network among a series of providers, health systems, and payers that allows us to share and validate provider information together, real time. And so what that means is if you're a health system in Baltimore, right, and you update a provider information today, it flows through to all of the other participants in the blockchain network. And so the information is always accurate to the most recent update of information. And you don't have to wait another 2 or 3 weeks for that to flow through the United Healthcare or the Aetna or whoever it might be's network to get it right. And that's actually one of the biggest pain points for people is finding a doctor, finding the right point of care. And that's just one example of how we're trying to take some of the most advanced technologies and make them real for people at those moments where they're trying to experience and utilize healthcare.
Yeah, that's really cool. I can think of a whole bunch of other places where I'm sure that's really helpful. Okay, so you piqued our interest. You told us that somebody in this room got you on the way to United Healthcare, so spill it.
I love the reverse. So Terry Clark.
Yeah, there you go.
Terry Clark's the Chief Marketing Officer for United Health Group. And Terry and I were on the board of the Minnesota Children's Museum for 5, 6 years, Terry. And so when I found out about this opportunity at United Healthcare, I called him. And I actually think you want to talk about goodness paying. I think this is another example of that, of Terry and I serving our community, right? Relationship being built, reputation being built, and that coming back around to provide the right level of influence on who I was and what my reputation was inside of United Healthcare. I interviewed on Monday, Thursday, Friday, had an offer on Saturday. Still the fastest executive hiring at United Healthcare.
Yeah.
So thanks, Terry.
Yeah. So I'm asking this question on behalf of your wife, your children, and your people on your team.
Yeah.
You said to us that you are profoundly impatient.
Oh.
How does that work for and against you?
Oh, so the good thing is Amy's not here to rebut anything I say. So
yeah, but I'm sure she uses the internet, so we're going to figure this out.
So it works for me in the sense of I refuse to accept mediocrity, right? It works for me in having high standards. It works for me. And those high standards are not just about work. Those high standards are for
garbage.
Exactly.
Yeah,
right?
that's right.
One job. But I make it a priority to find ways to spend time with my family. I am no one's example of work-life balance. And what I mean by that is my work-life balance goes like that, right? And so I take the time to make it a priority to spend time with my family. They ultimately have the vote, but I think I do a pretty good job of it, even though there may be periods where I'm gone for a while, and then I'm home, and everything's off, and I am present. Where it works against me, and I'll give you a team and a family one as well, my team will tell you that I frustrate easily. And I think I frustrate easily because I have high standards for them. And I sometimes have to gut check myself and count to 10 and breathe to make sure that I respond in a way that is productive and constructive, even when what I really want to say is probably something not really nice, right? And so I think it works against me there. I think it works against me with my kids, especially my son, who is much like me in many respects. And I can't tell you how many times I've heard from all 6 members in my family that they don't work for me. And it's usually not said nicely. You say that to your kids, say it nicely. That one doesn't come out nicely ever. And so I don't know, there's pros and cons to it.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
I think we have to probe this one farther. Yeah, yeah. You know, anytime you hear somebody, one of your principles in life is work hard, really hard, and then you say 5 kids. I mean, how does that work? I mean, I'm assuming these are fantastic children, but what is your equation in that? How do you make it work?
I think I make it work imperfectly, to be brutally honest. But I've had certain priorities over the years. I always take my kids' birthdays off. I always take them to breakfast on their birthdays. And so I've set these rules. And to be perfectly honest, in my job today, it gets a lot harder. So May 21st, Stella will turn 16. May 21st, I'm in California for a meeting. And I told her that a month ago. And I've probably heard about it 15 times since. And so how do I, as they get older and as I grow in my career and I'm unable to deliver on some of those commitments when they were little, how do I have a conversation with them, a relationship conversation with them around, I work really hard, and so it means that some of the things that I may have committed to you before, I can't deliver on now, but here's how I'm gonna make it up to you. And so I guess I negotiate, I discuss.
We all do.
I do my best to, frankly, be humble with my children, right? And be vulnerable with my children and let them know that I'm not perfect either, right? You know, and I think actually that's a really good message for, like, you should apologize to your kids, right? And it's a really good message to them that you are fallible as well. And I think that's a great message for kids to have as they grow up, is like it's okay to be fallible, right? So.
When we were working on what your outline was going to be for the speech, you had a concept in there that called "take the tough assignments."
Yeah.
So tell me about that. What does that mean?
You grow in the toughest assignments. You really do. I talked to you about wanting to work internationally, and that was ultimately my goal. So I got that opportunity when I was with Accenture, and the way it ended up, a partner at Accenture, Mike Rogalski, came and tapped me on my shoulder. It was a Thursday afternoon in the Accenture Tower downstairs. And he said, "Hey, do you think you can be in France on Monday? We've got a 4 to 6 week project." And at that point, I'd been married maybe 4 months. And actually, this is recorded, but I'm gonna say it anyway. I actually said yes before I called Amy. Even though I told Amy that I was calling her to decide what I was going to decide. But my mind was already made up. And, I think for a lot of people, if you think, I would have been 22, 23, no, I would have been 25 years old. The idea of dropping everything in your life here to go run off, even if to a cool country and a cool place for 6 weeks away from your new bride. And I knew that if I could do it, and that 4 to 6 weeks turned into 6 months, turned into a year, turned into almost 3 years. And it was probably one of the biggest inflection points in my career. And if I had taken the safe answer and said no, I don't know if I'd be standing here or in the position that I'm in right now.
It's a great story. Thank you. Well, let's close. I traditionally ask this question as the last question to everybody who speaks here. And that is to please tell us when you knew, a specific story or a specific moment when you knew for sure that goodness pays.
Yeah. Well, it's a retroactive story because I just learned about the goodness concept. But when I think about what I've done in my career, I'll tell you a story. When I was at Target, I led the program to get our digital platforms off of Amazon and bring them in-house. The hardest thing I've ever done, the most fun I've ever had professionally. And one of the things that I did was I installed what was called the countdown clock. And there's some Target people in here who might remember that, where I essentially installed this massive digital clock on our floor here in the US and on our floor in our India location that counted down to when our contract with Amazon was going to end and when we needed to be live. And some of my peers came up to me and said, "That's the meanest thing you could have done. Think about the pressure that you've put on your team." And I actually think it was the exact opposite, and it proved to be the exact opposite. The first one is I communicated it in a way that we're all in it together, and we're all shooting towards that goal, right? I communicated it in a way of this is about motivation and focus. right? And we're not going to worry about anything else except that countdown. And when people walked in every morning and saw that focus, and then in the course of what we did, everything of what we did it together. We worked with our employees on the program in a way where we were all about that singular goal. We worked with our vendors on the program in a way that we were all about that singular goal. And we made it fun, right? We used the clock as a source of fun as well. And so in that moment, I realized you can do something really hard, but if you have singular focus on a goal, if you have the right camaraderie and the right support for your teams, especially a global team here in the US and in India, you can accomplish great things. There are many people who bet against us on that project, and many people that didn't think we'd deliver what we needed to deliver, and we did it, and we did it successfully. And I would argue that I don't think Target would be in the position that it is today as a great multi-channel, amazing retailer if we hadn't had the singular focus to get that project done back in 2011.
Fantastic story. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Phil.